Hi all, so this is a quick video to show you how to complete the lab assignment for microphone recording. So all we're going to do here is we're going to grab these files, which are going to be in a zip file, and we're going to drag them into Reaper, and then you're going to choose one of them to apply our standard effects to, and then we're also going to add a reverb track to the mix. And then you're going to export that single file that you selected, and you're going to take a screenshot of your EQ settings for that file. So here I'm going to grab these, I'm going to drag them into Reaper. I've got in Reaper just a blank file open. So I drag those files over, drag them into Reaper. Reaper is going to ask me if I want to put them on separate tracks or on a single track. So I'm going to put them on separate tracks. And then they're going to be dragged kind of in the back. So I'm going to grab them, drag them to the front. And here we have all of these tracks. And notice that names the tracks for you according to the name of the file. So what these are an Mbira recorded 4 different ways with 4 different microphones. So I'm going to rearrange these to sort of put them into pairs. So the aboves are going to go together. The behinds are going to go together. Whoops, make sure it's not nested. The fronts are going to go together. And then these out of phases are going to go together. So each of these are showing their Mbira recorded from 4 different perspectives. This is from a microphone above the Mbira, this is from a microphone behind the Mbira, this is a microphone in front of the Mbira, and then this is a microphone where the SM57 is quite far away from the Mbira. And I actually had to boost the volume of the SM57 quite a bit to get it to be comparable to the 414 because it was further away and also because the microphone input gain was a little bit low on this track. So when we want to listen to these, the way that I like to do it is mute all of these tracks. So I can just click and drag on the mute button, and then just solo a single track and listen to it. You're not going to be able to hear that because I have to go and select telestream for my output. And then I can select this one. This is the same performance, but using the SM57, which is using the 414. 414, remember, is our large diaphragm condenser microphone. SM57 is our dynamic microphone. Notice that the SM57 is noisier. That's actually because the preamp gain for this was a little bit too low, and I increased the amplitude, but when I increased the amplitude of this inside Reaper, it also increased the background noise that was recorded on the track. Whereas the 414 was recorded probably at the better level. You can hear that there's some background noise, but it's really just the room noise, primarily. So you can listen to all of these and kind of compare what the 2 microphones sound like. Another way, by the way, I like to do is if you unmute this track and play, all of these tracks are muted, so we're only going to hear this track. And now if I solo this track, we're only going to hear this track. So you can go back and forth really easily. The SM57 is a little bit louder than the 414, so I'm going to bring the SM57 down to the same volume. And you can hear the different sound quality of these 2 different tracks. It's maybe a bit subtle, but it's definitely apparent if you listen. Probably you're going to choose one of the above, behind, or front tracks to mix. The out of phase I put in here just as a kind of fun way to explore the effect of phase when one microphone is much further away from the sound source than the other microphone. So I'm going to solo both of these and play them together. And now I'm going to flip the phase of one of these tracks. That's what this here is. And this is just going to revert it 180 degrees. And when I do that, notice that the timbre of the combination of tracks is going to kind of change. And you'll especially hear it on the low notes. So if I go in here and I just focus, so that those 2 low notes. So you can hear when one of these tracks is inverted or when a track is not inverted, a big difference in the amplitude of some of the low frequencies in these tracks. And this is typical for when microphones are placed really far apart. Actually, if we do the same thing over here, these microphones are placed really close together. So you can hear how inverting the phase of one of the microphones has a really big impact on the sound. Sometimes when their microphones are at different distances, inverting the phase will help the sound and sort of cancel out or like reverse some of the phase cancellation that happens. It's really just something to play around with. It's never a perfect solution. Phase inverting will have a pretty big impact, and you just have to decide what sounds better to you. So we're going to assume we're not going to use one of these. We're going to use one of these, and I'm just going to choose one of these 6 tracks at random. I'll just use the one on top. Solo it. I'm going to go ahead and select the whole sound file. And now I can go into my effects tab and add my standard effects. So I'm going to add a re-EQ for my high pass filter. I'm going to set that to be a high pass. And I'll come back and tweak that a little bit later. I'm going to add a compressor. It's going to be the re-comp. Click OK. I'm going to set it just to like a 2-to-1 ratio. Leave the threshold where it is. I'll have to come back and tweak that later as well. And I'm going to add a regular re-EQ again for my primary EQ. And now I can play the sound file. So to set that so it's just not really impacting the sound at all, just kind of getting rid of any extra low frequencies. So here I'm just listening for how it's evening out the overall dynamics. And depending on what I want to happen here, I might apply more or less compression. For this by itself, I'm just going to put it on so you'll see that this will kick in a little bit, only on the louder notes. You see there's really loud notes kicking quite a bit. If I bypass this, hear how much some of those notes really stand out. With the compressor on, those notes that are slightly louder will be a little bit more even. A little more consistent volume level. I'll probably back this off a little bit. I like compression to be very subtle, so you don't even really notice that it's happening. It's just those loud peaks kind of get brought down in level. Now I'm going to get a re-EQ, and at this point, I will just drag these around. I'll probably make sure that they're all band filters. I like to use 4 band filters rather than low and high shelving filters. And you can just experiment with different frequencies. What I like to do here, and actually I'll go ahead and disable all of these except for one, is I'm going to set the bandwidth of this to be quite narrow, right? So I'm only amplifying or cutting a very small range of frequencies. And I'm going to play the track. And you kind of isolate different parts of the track. So with a very narrow bandwidth, I can see the sort of like resonant frequencies or the fundamental frequencies of the tines of the mbira. Here I'm getting more of the rattle. Here I'm getting some of the pluck of the tines. And here's maybe just more brightness. And then you can broaden that a little bit and do the same thing. And then when you're actually applying your EQ, I like to avoid doing big boosts. I like to mostly, if I'm going to do a big EQ change, I'm going to do a big cut. So for example, if I decide for some reason that the low frequencies of this are way too, or it's not bright enough, and I really need to increase the brightness a lot, I'll bring down the low frequencies. And that'll have the effect of making the whole thing be brighter. Similarly, if I decide it's too bright, or if I want it to be darker, I might do this, and now some of the low frequencies are left alone, but I'm sort of cutting these frequencies. So I want you just to use your ears. You should use at least 3 bands to tweak the EQ. You don't have to use all 4 if you don't want to, but you should use at least 3. So there should be some small boosts and any larger EQ, anything more than like 3 or 4 dB, even 3 dB is quite a bit, should be a cut. You can do like large amounts of cuts if you want to, but only small amounts of boosts, and kind of move it around and sort of see what makes the sound better. And if you really feel like that you don't like a lot of EQing, if you think that it overall sounds kind of okay and you just kind of want to nudge it a little bit, that's okay. You don't have to do drastic EQs. And in class, we'll listen to a couple of these and see what people came up with. So once I have set my EQ the way I want it to be, don't worry, we're not worrying too much about the high pass and the compressor in this assignment. Just set those at reasonable values with a minimal compression and a reasonable high pass that doesn't really affect the sound very much. Mostly focus on the EQ. And then when you're done, you can select the item that you want to choose. You're going to go through, you're going to edit the beginning and the end. So I'm going to go ahead and zoom in on the beginning. I can see this is sort of just dead space, right? So I'm going to, I'm locked right here, right? Notice how I try to move this, it locks to those grid lines. I don't want that to happen. So I'm going to turn off the locking, drag that over. Reaper automatically applies a little fade, right? So that's what this little red line is. And you can make the fade be longer if you want to, or shorter. In the beginning fades, I like the beginning fade and the beginning of the track to sort of start right on it. Right here, just the note starts playing. You don't really hear any sound before the note. But on the end of the note, notice that the sound rings. And it's good practice, and I didn't really do a great job of this in this recording. It's good practice when you're playing and you finish playing, let the note ring to silence, and then let there be another couple of seconds before you start making a background sound. Because you can kind of hear right here, the note is still ringing when I sort of put the ambiura down. Right? And so I have to edit the sound right here, because that's obviously not part of the ambiura performance. But I would rather have had that be a little bit longer. I'm going to drag this a little bit longer. That's not the most natural fade. I made too much background noise when I didn't let the note ring to silence without walking away. So that's bad practice on my part. Okay, so once you've done that, we can select the track. We're going to go to File, Render. We're going to render the master mix. So this is what you're listening to in your headphones. And the bounds are going to be the entire project. So that's going to render an audio file, which is actually like all the way up to here, I believe, which is not maybe what you want. Let's actually not do that. Let's go in here and let's use this selection tool to select only the sound file that we're rendering. There we go. So now we've got the selection starting at the beginning before we fade in and starting at the end right after we fade out. And actually, before we do anything, we also have to add our reverb track. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to insert a new track. I'm going to call it reverb, or just verb is oftentimes a shorthand for reverb. Drag it to the bottom. Go to my mix view. Here's my verb track. I'm going to add reverbate. I'm going to make sure the dry signal is turned all the way down. And now I've got to go to my track and I'm going to route it, add a new send to the reverb. And I only have one track going sending to the reverb. So I would send how much I want to send using this fader right here. And you can kind of see it being reflected right there. And probably you can double click there and sort of tweak the reverb send right there. So let's play that track. And if you want to hear the reverb, what I often do is play it, stop the track, and when you stop the track, the reverb will continue to ring. And right now it's kind of a very short reverb. If I increase the reverb size, maybe even use a preset. Let's try live vocal. That's a pretty subtle reverb too. I add a little bit more just so we can really hear the impact of it. We'll have to dry signal here. That's too subtle. Dark corridor, that sounds promising. Oof. I'd say it's probably too much reverb, so I'm going to bring the room size down a little bit. Now, I can change the reverb size, which is like the length. Long reverb. Very short reverb. I can change the brightness. Hear how bright that is? Or dark reverb. Not as bright. And do a couple of other things. There's a low pass and a high pass filter built into this. We're not going to worry about for that for right now. Okay, so that sounds like a reasonable amount for the size. And now I can go in here and can change the reverb amount. I find it helpful to So, if I go in here, no reverb. Reverb can actually be fairly subtle, but it definitely adds a lot to the sound. So you can use whatever amount of reverb you want to, just play around with it and get a sense for how this works and what kind of effect it has on the sound. Okay, so I've got my reverb track added now. I've got my reverb. The thing about reverb is because reverb will ring after the track ends, you always want to have what you're bouncing out to be a little bit beyond the track because there's still reverb even over here, even after this track is sort of finished because the reverb continues to ring. So I want to make sure there's plenty of space here. Maybe even make it be a little bit more, just give myself lots of room. This is probably more than enough. So now I'm going to go to File, Render the master mix. We're going to choose our time selection, which is what we just chose here. We're going to give it a file name. This is my Mbira mix. I'm going to make sure it is the right sample rate. I like to do always 48K. For when I'm exporting, I oftentimes will leave it at 16-bit, depending on what I'm doing. But for just like something cheap and cheerful like this, that's fine. And this, when I click render one file, is going to render that file to disk. So if you're curious, if you don't know where it's rendering to, it'll tell you. I'm going to render to my Reaper Media folder, which is just in my Documents folder. And then it's always good practice to go back to your Finder, find that folder, or find that file rather. Here it is, Mbira Mix, and listen to it just to make sure it rendered correctly. So I'll normally listen to the beginning and the ending to make sure the beginning and ending are clean. And this is another time to make sure that you did your fades correctly, right? Should start naturally and should end naturally. And with that, you are done. Go back to Reaper, open your effects, take a screenshot of your EQ, and then submit that with your track and also with a note about which track you chose to use. And you're done with the assignment.